field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people speaking their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody looks, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to today's special edition of The Robust Opposition. With me is author and clinical psychologist Bruce Levine. How you doing, Bruce?
I'm doing great.
Thank you for being on the show. I am so excited to talk about your book that I just finished called Resisting Illegitimate Authority. You talk about in your book famous anti-authoritarians like Thomas Paine, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Malcolm X, Henry David Thoreau, Noam Chomsky, Ralph Nader, George Carlin, Lenny Bruce, and so many more. You know, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get into anecdotes about each one of them, but I have to say that I recognized some attributes of myself in each one of them. It made me feel so good about joining this club of anti-authoritarians resisting illegitimate authority. What do you mean by anti-authoritarian? And how does authoritarian differ from authoritative? And what do you mean by illegitimate authority? And how does that differ from what Chomsky calls justified authority?
Okay, good. I'm glad you stopped there. I can't remember any more questions than what you threw, but let me start with authoritarian. And that means really dictionary definition of authoritarian. You look at any dictionary, it just means unquestioning obedience to authority. And so really, though, it's what the important thing is, though, you could have authoritarians who are in charge, in control, who demand unquestioning obedience, and you could have subordinates who provide that unquestioning obedience. So one of the examples I give in the book from our many authoritarian leaders we've had is from Lyndon Johnson, who he talks about what he'd liken as from an appointee, and he says, I would like this person to be able to kiss my ass at high noon in Macy's window and tell me it smells like roses. And the reason I use that example was that clearly that's an authoritarian sentiment, but anybody who's willing to kiss LBJ's ass to get the job, also an authoritarian. So an anti-authoritarian then means somebody who does not provide that unquestioning obedience. Okay, they will question whether an authority is legitimate or not. We'll talk about legitimacy in a second. But for an anti-authoritarian, if they question if that authoritarian is illegitimate, not legitimate, they're going to challenge, they're going to resist that authority. And we can talk anti-authoritarian is not necessarily against all authority. Okay, just illegitimate authority. Although there are some people, anarchists, for example, who believe all authority is illegitimate, not legitimate, but not all anarchists believe that. So it gets a little complicated. So the other question said authoritative. It's an interesting that authoritative and authoritarian are so close and mean so much, so opposite, very different. Authoritative means somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, somebody who's knowledgeable, somebody who really, and has nothing to do with an authoritarian. So the last thing I think, maybe I didn't get them all here, but the last thing that you asked was, how do you assess whether somebody is an illegitimate authority or not? And for me, this is very subjective. For me, big reasons, anti-authoritarians I've known will assess whether an authority knows what they're talking about, whether they're honest, trustworthy, exploitative, but it's very subjective. But I will say, for me, the quality of somebody's life, from my point of view, is their ability to assess whether an authority is legitimate or not legitimate. And I think it's how good a society you're going to have is whether you have all illegitimate, non-legitimate authorities in control, or you have really legitimate authorities. So I think it's a huge issue.
I remember reading a parenting book about the difference between authoritative and authoritarian. And then there was the third category, which was permissive. So authoritarian parenting is no good because you're telling your kids what to do, and you're using coercion and punishment to get them to do that. And permissive, the opposite, and I think you described George Carlin as being a permissive parent, is basically letting the kid do whatever they want. And authoritative was something in between, where you just, with kindness and empathy, but with authority, just basically let the kid know why, standards, boundaries, expectations, things like that. I want to talk more about activism, because as an activist, and a lot of my viewers are activists, this is where we relate to it more so than in terms of personal relationships. You talk about the difference between dissent and disobedience. In your conclusion, you wrote, when dissent, be it through public opinion polls, protests, demonstrations, or otherwise, becomes impotent in changing policy, this is an indicator of living under authoritarian rule. If a society is not authoritarian, then the tension that dissent creates is resolved so that the dissenters experience their grievances being taken seriously, as evidenced by policy changes. In authoritarian society, dissenters, even when in the majority, routinely feel impotent and helpless. Dissent without disobedience is essentially no threat to authoritarians in power. Clever authoritarians welcome dissent without disobedience, since it can be easily ignored and provides the illusion of a free and democratic society. Only disobedience can threaten authoritarians. So I would contend that while Trump is an authoritarian, even though people are calling him a fascist, that's another whole show we could debate, our society for the last 40 years is best characterized as a neoliberal corporatocracy or plutocracy, where dissent is also marginalized. And we can see so much performative protests that we have, where people go out in the streets and they chant, whose streets? Our street. Show me what democracy looks like. And they hold a sign and then they post about it on social media, and that's it, right? So none of these protests that we've been having since Trump has come into office have changed a damn thing. In the chapter on Thomas Paine, you said, he said that it was not just King George, but the whole monarchy that was illegitimate. So your thoughts on Trump, authoritarian, neoliberalism, the kind of protest that we've been doing?
Okay, so I think this is a huge point of the book, of people understanding when you have an authoritarian society, exactly what I said in that book is that they're not going to care about dissent. They really don't. And you have to really keep that in mind. I mean, if you're living in a real democracy, then people care about dissent. You can protest, you can vote, you can do all of these things. And one of the real, I don't know if tragedy is too strong a word, but it's certainly sad. It makes me sad is that when young folks get involved in the electoral process and they don't understand that if you've got an authoritarian, and fascism, by the way, is just one kind of an authoritarian. There's many kinds of authoritarians, out there. So anybody who demands unquestioning obedience, and certainly anybody who's a fascist demands unquestioning obedience, is an authoritarian. When you have that kind of authoritarian control, whether it's, now the DNC is authoritarian, and so Trump is a sort of in-your-face, sort of cartoonish, clownish, Mussolini kind of authoritarian. But there's many kinds of authoritarians. And so when you have that, I think it's really important for people to understand they don't care about dissent. And one of the really sad things for me is with all people going through all this schooling more and more, 100 years ago, in the early 1900s, you had very few people even be high school graduates, no college graduates. My dad didn't go to college. He was a union worker. They all knew that the people who were authoritarians couldn't care less about dissent. You had to strike. I grew up, like I said, in a union family, and you knew that they didn't care. If they had power, the only power you had was a strike. So the only power you have in an authoritarian society, and this is not original to me, this is people like Gene Sharp in talking about how do you deal with dictators, is that you have to withdraw your cooperation with them. You can withdraw that through a strike, through all kinds of boycotting. There's different ways that he goes through, hundreds of different ways you could do that, but just dissent is not going to move an authoritarian. Oh, they're going to laugh at that.
Yeah, I read that book during Occupy, Gene Sharp's book, Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I was a Bernie Sanders supporter. I ran LA for Bernie 4 years ago. I was a delegate when he conceded to Hillary 2 weeks before the convention and didn't bring his 25 minority reports from the platform to the floor of the convention. I organized the TPP protest that you may have seen, with everybody holding up the TPP signs with the slash in front of them. And because, we just didn't want to be there for some coronation of Hillary Clinton. So we did as delegates, because we weren't listening to Bernie. He sent us a text as a courtesy to me. I would appreciate it if you would not protest. And we ignored him.
Since you bring up Bernie Sanders, he's a very interesting character for me, and I touch on him in the book, okay, because one of the real, and I would call it tragic. His life is tragic because he, as a young guy, knew the whole story about Eugene Debs. He did a documentary about Eugene Debs. So he can't hide behind certain notions of like, I didn't know how it would turn out. Anybody who does a documentary about Eugene Debs knows that Eugene Debs, by the time he was in his 30s, he had been just a conservative labor leader, and it became clear to him, Eugene Debs, that my God, you just do anything that opposes the Democratic Party here. In this first time, it was with Grover Cleveland, second time with Woodrow Wilson, and they throw him in jail. And in his 30s, he had this turnaround, Eugene Debs, to realize that the Democratic Party, there's quotes from him, and the Republican Party are all controlled by the rich folks who run this society. And that's why he refused, he ran as a socialist candidate, got 6% of the vote in 1912, enraged Woodrow Wilson, who, threw him in prison for speaking out against World War I. And Bernie Sanders knows this whole story. He knows that the Democratic Party, Republican Party, controlled by these corporate elite. He used to talk about it when he was mayor of Burlington. And this is a real tragedy. He was an impressive mayor of Burlington in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan is president. It was mind-blowing. It was a very impressive guy. And for whatever reason, I'm not going to psychoanalyze Bernie Sanders, but for whatever reason, he chose to sort of forget everything he knew. And now what you have a situation is, it breaks my heart. I want to enlist you in doing this. By the way, we need to do therapy on young people here who bought in to Bernie Sanders and have had their heart broken. I know them. All these folks out there, they really believed in him, and he first sells them out and goes for Hillary Clinton, who's like the most you had the two most disliked people in America running for president in 2016, and they surpassed him. Now he's going to support Joe Biden. And I think for folks who just focus on lesser of two evils, they don't understand the damage, especially for young people, of violating their integrity year after year after year and voting for somebody who they're repulsed by, who they're disgusted by. And Bernie Sanders, at the very least, needs to acknowledge that and apologize and say, hey, I hope somehow you can get your strength back from doing something like this that I'm telling you to do here.
All right. Well, I'm searching here, looking for this article that I wrote called Bernie Don't Do It in the LA Progressive. It was 2 days before he endorsed, or maybe it was the day before he endorsed Hillary Clinton. I started out by doing a quote from a Facebook page called The Confirmed California Delegates. These are people that had run and were elected, like me, and who were going to the convention. So somebody posted this. If Senator Sanders endorses Mrs. Clinton, it should be expected that some percentage of delegates would not show up in Philly, and many of those who do will be harboring great resentment towards the campaign itself. Millions of voters will instantly retreat to the resignation and despair with party politics that they harbored before this campaign. The momentum of this revolution will largely come to an end. Base supporters will effectively be returned to the masses of disenchanted potential voters who justifiably feel that most politicians can't be trusted because they so frequently sell you out when they're most needed. Over the last 13 months, I've managed hundreds of volunteers. Dozens of them have individually expressed to me and others that they would, quote, burn their Bernie shirts if he ever endorsed the epitome of everything we're fighting against, unquote. Nobody is immune to the backlash of endorsing the nation's most corrupt politician, even the father of our political revolution. Most of the 13 million people who voted for Senator Sanders had not heard of him before he announced his candidacy. To these people, he represents more than just the social and environmental issues that resonate with them. He represents the very notion that there can still be integrity in the U.S. Congress. If he endorses the very establishment candidate he railed against, he could lose those people to politics forever. So I am totally with you. And this is why I did not organize for him this time. This and some other reasons, you know, most notably, he had very bad people in his campaign, but, and didn't really respect his volunteers when it came down to it. You know, that's a whole nother show, and I've done that show. But what you're talking about is so true. And this time he dropped out halfway through. It was like quitting the game at halftime. He didn't even go through all the primaries. Now,
Well,
he can make an excuse about the coronavirus all he wants. But this coronavirus made clear that his candidacy was the one that we needed.
This was pretty obvious this was going to come, you know, and as I said in the book there, Ralph Nader talked about the fact that, you know, Bernie Sanders wouldn't respond to his phone calls since the year 2000, and because Bernie Sanders was afraid from the very get-go of being another pariah, another Ralph Nader. He didn't have that kind of courage. He didn't have that Eugene Debs, Ralph Nader courage, which said, I don't care. And in Debs' case, I don't care if you throw me in prison. I'm not going to violate, betray the people who really believed in me. I'm not going to do that. Well, no one's even asking, you or I are not asking Bernie to go to prison here. I think all we're asking, at least all I'm asking, I'll see if you agree, is that realize how much damage you've done to young people here by this kind of selling out, by asking them to endorse somebody who they got into politics to oppose. And now you're asking them over and over again, and tell them the truth. That basically what you knew in your 30s, that the Democratic Party, Republican Party here, they're both controlled by corporate powers. This is what you said over and over again. And what you also know from your study of Eugene Debs, that the only way regular people, the 99%, get anything in America is by withdrawing their cooperation one way or another. That by some kind of act of disobedience. And it doesn't have to, and we're not talking about violence here, okay? Because authoritarians love violence. We could get into all that. There's lots of ways that you withdraw cooperation with them to force them to give you, to meet some of your needs and meet some of your demands. And he knows all this, Bernie. Yeah. And he owes it to young people out there who are depressed, disenchanted, all that, to tell them, I'm sorry. I had this idea. Maybe he had this idea. He could get his agenda out there, and that would be a good thing. Let's give him that he had good intentions in all of this. But to be able to say, I'm sorry, it didn't work. My strategy didn't work.
We were all crediting him with being anti-establishment, but by very definition of having been in the institution of the Senate, for the Congress, for 30 years, he is by definition establishment. And you can tell the way he qualifies his terms. Political revolution, not a revolution. A political revolution essentially came to mean reforming the Democratic Party. So it's not there's a difference between revolution and reform. He wanted reform. And then there's democratic socialism. He really isn't a democratic socialist in the sense that some Europeans are, because he didn't advocate for nationalizing certain industries. He really was more of an FDR style Democrat.
Right.
So he kind of teased people with these terms like socialist and revolution, but when it came down to it, he was neither a socialist nor a revolutionary. And I talked to Barney Frank on the floor, you know, in the Rules Committee the night before the convention started. And I was trying to talk to these Hillary delegates about how Bernie Sanders was using his office for the bully pulpit. You know, they said he never got anything done. And Barney Frank came over and I said, Barney, tell these guys that Bernie was the amendment king in Congress. He got more amendments passed than anyone. And he said, yeah, well, they were about useless things. And then I said, but what about him using the bully pulpit? And he said, well, yeah, he should have been doing that, you know, for us in the party. And like nothing that Bernie did was acceptable to this establishment guy. He was never accepted or liked by his peers in that institution. All of a sudden, in 2016, where he never expected to win, he just wanted to mount a challenge to Hillary, he sees this popularity that he has for his ideas. And he loves to give this speech, whether it's on the floor of the Congress or whether it's at a big rally. So when he's the organizer in chief, he loves to organize rallies and internet talk shows. But he doesn't know how to organize people, because if he did, he should have voted no on the corporate bailout. It would have gone down in history as one of his lone courageous votes. He should have left the Senate, kept running for president, and organized rent strikes and general strikes. Because in a pandemic, you have a situation you haven't seen in 100 years, where people are at home, ready to be organized. and people are going to have depression era levels of unemployment, 25, 30%. I had interviewed the Amazon warehouse worker that got fired for blowing the whistle and organizing a walkout at the JFK Staten Island warehouse. He became an organizer because he developed class consciousness on the job. He wasn't an organizer, an activist before. He was a normal guy that was now all of a sudden being asked to put his life in jeopardy. And that's when the light went on in his head. Bernie could have organized workplaces, apartment buildings, neighborhoods to do these general strikes. He didn't have the vision to do that. And also,
well, here's the thing, and that we get back to what you were talking about in the resisting illegitimate authority. What I wanted to make it clear for young people and everybody reading it, but especially for young people, is that anti-authoritarians, when it comes down to it, they have guts, they have courage, they are willing to, in some cases, I talk about folks willing to die, like Malcolm X and some other folks I talk about, but at least willing to go to prison. And if not that, even Ralph Nader was willing to become a pariah. He was willing to become ostracized. And Bernie, from the get-go, if you take a look, was not willing to be. He was not an anti-authoritarian, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying the guy wasn't a bad guy. Maybe he's the best you're going to get in the Democratic Party. I'm not saying he's a horrible guy, but he's not an anti-authoritarian. And a lot of people were fooled because he would use terms like you were saying, like he would talk about socialism. That was a bold term, but it turned out it was a smart political thing to get him a lot of attention, and the timing was great for him. But when it came time to really challenging things that would get him in deep trouble, and it's not just talking about challenging the Democratic Party at the end of the day, challenging the military-industrial complex, he really backed off on that. And but people cut him slack. People even like Cornel West and a lot of folks really liked him. I do. I cut him slack. Okay, so you don't have enough guts to challenge the military-industrial complex. Okay, you're not perfect. But when he just started, and this is something for people to remember. I think it's sort of like when you move into an abusive relationship, whether it's with the DNC or with your spouse. As soon as you start doing things that aren't who you really are, you get weaker, you get smaller. And you put up with more and more, and before you know it, you're nothing. And that's something for people to remember. This goes on a big scale in politics, on the job. It goes on in relationship, and that's what I care a lot. That's what I do mostly for a living. That's my day job, trying to help people extricate from abusive relationships, because I know how deadly they are once you start violating your integrity.
When you say that maybe he has an abusive relationship with the institution of Congress then? And what about my theory that he just wants to be liked? He's only human, and they put him in the leadership. They gave him that bullshit job, director of outreach, remember?
Well, it's one of the real things which should be scary for any parent if their kid goes into politics. And I know some parents whose kids gone into politics, and they were smart enough to be scared, because what happens is that some of these folks they couldn't care less about anything, like Donald Trump. They just want to get ahead. But a lot of them, probably Bernie was like this, and a lot of others, they're ambitious, they're careers, they want to get ahead, but they really believe in something. They believe in some ideals. But what happens is to the extent that you're successful, what's most likely to happen is you're more and more going to get good at figuring out what's the most popular thing to do. I mean, you saw this with Barack Obama. You see this with a lot of folks. And before they know it, they wake up and they're a husk. There's nothing to them anymore. What are they believing in? And Bernie Sanders, I hate to be that guy going, well, he's lucky he's an atheist and he doesn't believe in God or heaven. But because if he did, he would go like, oh my God, I'm going to meet Eugene Debs in heaven, and I'm going to have to tell him that I supported these warmongers, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. Oh my God, how am I going to meet them? And that's really, at some level in his unconscious, he's got to be thinking that. It's sad. It's very tragic as far as I'm concerned.
In your first chapter about Thomas Paine, Ralph Nader, and Malcolm X, their compulsion for truth-telling makes it difficult for compromise and diplomacy. You say Paine was temperamentally and intellectually unsuited for the day-to-day affairs of government. So this is me. This is why I don't run for office, because I don't like to compromise. I don't like to glad handle. That's what you have to do in office in order to be successful. A very interesting interview with AOC in the New York Times last week talked about how she was the lonely vote against the fourth bailout bill. And she had talked to some of her colleagues, and she thought that some others would come along with her. She didn't name them, but I'm assuming maybe they're members of the squad. And when she ended up being the only one, it really put her in a terrible position. Because the thing about it is when you have 450 or however many there are in there, and you want to get something done, you need to support you want people to support your bills, you need to support their bills. And it becomes this thing of compromising. I've seen it as an activist, even working with nonprofit organizations. They need to get donors, they need to get funding, they need to have wins. So they do these small incremental things that they can call wins so they can keep the money flowing. Same thing with politicians. I learned this in college. Politicians don't exist to make change and represent their constituents. They exist to get reelected. So in order to get reelected, they have to raise money for donors. And that's where we get to, the two-party duopoly.
The reason a lot of people say, well, how could you have Thomas Paine, Ralph Nader, and Malcolm X in the same section? And for me, the thing that connects them was the idea that no matter how gigantic your contributions were, and all three of them were these huge contributions, that at the end of the day, they all went from societal standards so too far, and they got marginalized anyways. A lot of people don't know what happened at Thomas Paine. A lot of the founding fathers said if not for Thomas Paine, we probably would not have had an American Revolution. But ultimately, he's not just critical of the monarchy. He's not just critical. He's critical of organized religion and writes a book called The Age of Reason, and he becomes a pariah. And so same thing with Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader gets away with being critical of General Motors in the 1970s and all these health, and all these other corporations. But when he goes after the Democratic Party, he becomes a pariah. So that's a big part of that why all those folks are connected. The other thing that you're talking about is that there's a big difference. I think that I wanted to get across was that Ralph Nader and even Malcolm X and all of those folks, Thomas Paine even, they were capable of compromise. It wasn't that they were that rigid, completely rigid. And you don't strike me as somebody completely uncompromising. I'm not uncompromising. The difference is, though, for those folks and for real anti-authoritarians, they understand there's a certain line where if they're compromising their integrity, there's a big difference. And so when you hear people just say, always lesser of two evils, I want to say, are you going to vote? Who are you going to vote for when Harvey Weinstein runs against Bill Cosby? Are you going to vote for one of these guys? Well, I'm sure maybe one of them's a little better than the other. But at some point, when are you violating your integrity by voting for Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein? I mean, when the hell is that going to happen? And so that's the difference, as opposed to people who are realizing that, there's some times where you're not getting somebody who's perfect. Like Bernie Sanders wasn't perfect. He was supporting the military-industrial complex. For me, he was not a perfect candidate. But for me, to compromise and vote for him was not a violation of my integrity. And that's a key thing, because once you start violating your integrity, and this is what everybody's been asking the 99% to do for my entire lifetime, once they say, you always got to vote for lesser two evils, it doesn't matter. And they're not bringing up, are you violating your integrity here? Because if you are, you're getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And that's what's happened to our society, right, to the point where we have very little capacity to resist anything. And was my previous book. I wrote all about that.
So, this is Joe Biden right now. And you can see the cognitive dissonance that people are putting themselves through with this Tara Reade situation. They are completely villainizing her, questioning her history. Deborah Messing even tweeted the other day that she was arrested for shoplifting. That is classic rape culture, bringing up the I tweeted back, she could be a convicted murderer and she still could have been raped. This is just ridiculous. And then I have progressive friends on my own Facebook wall saying, I'll vote for a trained monkey over Trump, and they have what we call Trump derangement syndrome. They're the same, like blue no matter who. And then also they give you the expression, the perfect is the enemy of the good. I hate that expression. Because that is just a justification and a rationalization for compromise. If you don't stand for something and try to achieve that something, then what are you? It's like you're right. You have no integrity. I just wanted to read, because I was going to ask you about Ralph Nader and Bernie, and I pulled out a great quote from your book. You said, from 1980 to 2000, now that's 20 years, Nader recounted, we tried every way to get the Democrats to pick up on issues that really commanded that felt concern in daily lives of millions of Americans, but were issues that corporations didn't want to pay attention to. Clinton and his vice president, Al Gore, refused to meet with Ralph Nader, and Nader could not convince them to support even the most politically popular anti-corporatist agenda. That's because Clinton and Gore were too busy getting past the Republican agenda. Everything they did was what the Republicans wanted, but could never have passed it themselves.
Right.
Finally, Nader could no longer stomach the Democratic Party's complete betrayal, and he concluded that the United States now has one corporate party with two heads. What became increasingly clear to Nader was confirmed by former Democratic Party operatives such as Lawrence O'Donnell, later an MSNBC political operative. And you might be interested to know that young people are using this quote on Twitter right now, the video of him saying this to justify not voting for Biden. He says, if you don't show them you're capable of not voting for them, they don't have to listen to you. I promise you that. I worked within the Democratic Party. I didn't have to listen to anything on the left while I was working in that Democratic Party. Then Ralph Nader was marginalized, and Bernie didn't want to be another Ralph Nader. What brought me to you in the first place, and I don't even know how I found this article, but now that I have it, I can tell everybody the real title. It's called Shit Life Syndrome, Trump Voters and Clueless Dems. And you wrote this in Counterpunch in January of 2020. Define shit life syndrome, why Trump was able to get those voters, and what you think Joe Biden, since he's no Bernie Sanders, needs to do in order to get them back from Trump.
But a guy named Will Hutton over at The Guardian, he talked about it in an article about, and he talked about it in Great Britain and in the United States. And basically what this shit life syndrome means is part of it is being financially impoverished. So in the United States, I had written that article a few months after a Brookings study came out that showed I think it was 44% of Americans were living making $18,000 a year. And, which here I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio. You can't live on that even in Cincinnati, Ohio. Forget about where you're living. And so, but it was more than just financially impoverished. It was people living these kind of meaningless, alienating kind of lives. And also, too, another critical component that Hutton was talking about was that it was poverty in the face of inequality. So people looking around and saying, not only am I miserable here, all these people are having a good time, at least watching on their social media or on television. And so there was resentment. And so this is an important point. You were talking about resentment earlier. So when you move into resentment, and you move into victimization, which is what a lot of folks who have this shit life syndrome did, is that it creates a certain kind of psychology of oppression. And that's one of the things that I was talking about. I want to make clear in that article, I wrote another article a few months afterwards in Counterpunch to make clear that this shit life syndrome, these are not the only folks who are voting for Trump. I mean, his biggest contingency, people need to remember, are evangelicals. I mean, if you take a look at the numbers, exit polls in 2016, he got 81% of the evangelical vote. That's almost half of his 62 million total. And there was no exit polls on shit life syndrome. So I'm just speculating. But I know from living here in Ohio, which was a Trump state, everyone around, all the states around me are Trump states. So Kentucky across the river, people don't know if they've never been to Cincinnati. Kentucky's sort of like the Brooklyn. Northern Kentucky's like the Brooklyn for Cincinnati, right across the river. Actually, there's a little bridge that looks like the Brooklyn Bridge. Rolling built them both. And, across West Virginia is another border state, Michigan, Indiana. These are all bordering Pennsylvania. All of these are Trump states. Okay. And so in these states there's a lot of people who qualify in that category. But, a lot of these folks, if you take a look at the polls, white, rural, poor folks, they went for Trump. In 2016, and I went through in that article. If you take a look at people, and other folks have done articles where they've correlated places in America where you have high suicide and high opiate addiction and overdose, and these were Trump counties. Okay, so West Virginia, highest amount of overdose in the country, Ohio, and so it's an interest. So for me, it's if Democrats, when I was writing that, if they care now, for me, it's a joke. If Joe Biden's going to get elected, this article is just it's almost worthless. Okay, so maybe you're interested. People out there are interested. I tell folks to read my book and read some of the article, but in terms of actually trying to help Democrats get it, was part of the point that I made is when you're in that category of being so psychologically oppressed, being in that shit life syndrome, you're not listening to what politicians are saying. You don't take any of them seriously. All their promises, you've heard a zillion times before, one after another gets elected, your life's still miserable. And so what Trump, either by luck or somehow, I don't know, he got it just I think by luck. I don't think the guy's that bright a guy, but realize that when you're in that zone, what appeals to you is something outrageously different. Something unconventional. So you hear this guy Trump in the 2016 primaries. They've never seen anybody before, a Republican candidate, humiliating every other Republican candidate. It was like stunning. You're making fun of these guys, lying Ted, little Marco. It was like a cartoonish, stunning thing that made these folks pay attention. It was like they got to watch a cartoon. And so he became an intriguing guy. And I tell folks that I also knew a lot of folks in this part of the world, okay, who ultimately voted for Trump, who were interested in Bernie. They were interested in the old Bernie out there who's trashing the Democratic Party. That was interesting. A guy who's running as a Democratic nominee. He was never a Democrat before. He was an independent who trashed them. That made him a very interesting guy. And a lot of these folks out there in, sort of normal mainstream progressive land, they want to think that there's this huge difference between the left, the Bernie supporters and the Trump supporters. Well, there are significant differences for sure. But in terms of them hating the government, okay, hating a lot of their victimization of being screwed over by the corporatocracy, there's similarities. The big difference for me is that a lot of folks who are more left, more Bernie folks, realize that in the corporatocracy, the major partner in this corporate, rich folk corporation partnership are the rich people. It's not the government. The government is a junior partner. And these folks who are the Trumpoids, they somehow think the government is the senior partner. But I tell you what, I've had conversations with them, and it's not that hard to make the case of thinking you might want to reconsider who the junior and the senior partner is in this corporatocracy here. I wrote an article, later, saying once he backed Hillary Clinton, he just lost all credibility with the shit life syndrome world. It was like, God, if you don't have enough guts to stand up to the Democratic Party, you just don't got what it takes, for a lot of these folks. So he lost a lot of interest for them. Now, I know a lot of people out there just want to believe that all these Trumpoids are just racist nationalists, which a lot of them are. But like I said, there's a lot of different categories. If you live in this world that I live in, like I say, a lot of these folks are hypocritical evangelicals. A lot of these folks are there's a lot of Trump folks that just all they care about is the stock market. That's all they care about. So there's a lot of different elements to this kind of Trump armies that he has.
I agree with you. Do you think that the reason that maybe Bernie did not do as well in some of these primaries I have my own reasons about why he didn't have a ground game in any of the states beyond California, that maybe it had to do with what you just said, that he had lost a lot of the support of people after he conceded to Hillary.
Oh, yeah. I think there's a lot of folks. For a lot of people, I remember traveling through Vermont, when he was still, mayor of Burlington. This was wild. This guy's going around calling himself a socialist, and he's getting elected mayor, year after year in Burlington while Reagan's president. There was something kind of cool about that. I can't come up with a better word than that. And young people felt that. There was sort of something cool about this guy who felt kind of bold. All right. And when as soon as he came out, even though from the very beginning he said he was going to support the Democratic candidate, but the idea of this guy all of a sudden kind of complying and going along with supporting somebody who all these Bernie supporters were in it because they had complete contempt for Hillary Clinton. That's why they were in the whole thing. It was a carrot. And for these other folks, who these ultimate folks who voted for Trump, these folks, poor rural folks, it was he started to look like just every other kind of Democratic politician. And that was it. The game's over. Once he started to look like just every other Democratic politician, it's why should they bother? Why should they bother with him?
I guess what I was asking, though, about is in the Democratic primaries in 2020.
Again, back to the thing I've talked about several times, when people are terrified enough, and the left is terrified enough of Trump, that they can swallow anything. And so if you get folks terrified enough and then you sell them this idea that Biden is the only person who can win, and that's what they were all fighting for. electability. So if you go around, I'm sure even South Carolina, a lot of these folks who were, voted for him there in Biden, and that was his big state. That's what put him over the top. It was all about like, well, yeah, we know he ain't much, but he's the only one who could beat Trump. This is the only reason. So I've never met anybody who knows anybody who actually likes Joe Biden.
Right.
I mean, that's sort of stunning for me. There were actually some people who actually liked Hillary Clinton. They've actually, there were actually women who liked Hillary Clinton. I met them. But, there's nobody I know who likes this guy Biden. And it was all about because he was, somebody they thought who could beat Trump. And the really sad thing was that here Bernie saw, from Trump, that you could actually win the nomination by just coming out punching at all of these guys you have contempt for. And in a lot of ways, at some level, Bernie's got to have complete contempt for everybody up there who he was debating with. That he knew what liars and hypocrites. But he pulled it. He not only pulled his punches, he kept his hands in his pocket. And so at that point, people are like, what made him stand out? And so he lost that. But I mean, to your point, my feeling was that even after he did what he did with Hillary Clinton, even when he ran again this time, I don't know, better than me. Did he have anywhere near the crowds of young people and the kind of energy supporting him that he had in 2000? He had lost his luster. He lost his luster.
No, he had the crowds. But here's the thing. With the debate against Biden at the end, I don't know, talk about pharmaceuticals. Everybody said that they gave Biden something because he was very coherent. He didn't make gaffes. He didn't meander. And he was punching. And Bernie does not like to do debate prep. You take girls, we're all very good students. You know how schools reward girls, compliant behavior. Tulsi Gabbard prepared her little zinger. Elizabeth Warren prepared her little zinger. Kamala Harris prepared her little zinger. That little girl was me. Bernie doesn't do that. They prepare it, they practice it, they look for a moment to deliver it. Bernie actually asked Joe Biden, did you say that you were going to cut Social Security? And of course, Biden lies and says, no, I didn't say that. And Bernie looks flabbergasted. Like, what did he think? That Biden was going to tell the truth? What he should have done was he should have pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket and said, I got a green screen, so this doesn't always show up very well. Joe Biden, why did you say on September 10th, 1985, and I quote, I cut Social Security once, I cut it again, and I'll cut it a third time. In other words, like lawyers, they don't ask, did you? They ask the second question. You assume that that the person did the thing, and then you ask them why they did it, and you put it in quotes. That would have really stymied him if he had done it that way. But instead, he looks flummoxed, and he says to the audience, well, you can look it up on the YouTube. I mean, who gives the audience, viewers, homework? He should have been prepared for that. Also on Jimmy Fallon, when Jimmy Fallon asked him if he thought, Biden could beat Trump, Bernie says yes. I mean, essentially giving people permission to vote for Biden. And I just want you to close by telling people where you can buy, and hopefully not Amazon. It's called Resisting Illegitimate Authority, A Thinking Person's Guide to Being an Anti-Authoritarian, Strategies, Tools, and Models.
Well, you can get it anywhere. My publisher, if you want to get my publisher, is actually out in California in Chico. They're called AK Press. They were actually a anarchist collective, one or two or three major anarchists. I think the largest anarchist collective publisher in the world. And you could get it from these guys directly. Unfortunately, even an anarchist collective has to sell books. No one survives without Amazon. So I've got my books there. You go to my website, brucelevine.net, and you can pick wherever you want to. Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, go to AK, go wherever you want. But yeah, I mean, it's one of the humiliating things that everybody out there who's trying to make a living, including anarchist collectives, has to deal with Amazon.